Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The Antique Doll Hospital Death. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where we explore the mysteries of human nature through the eyes of Miss Marple, the village's most perceptive observer. I'm your host, William, and today we're stepping into a world where beauty masks deception, where treasured heirlooms conceal darker truths. Miss Marple has always believed that one need only observe carefully, for villages are much like families, and people are remarkably consistent in their natures. Today's mystery concerns dolls, collectors, and a death that would shake the quiet village of St. Mary Mead to its very core. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Collector's Obsession. The autumn rain had been particularly relentless that year, and Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, observing the village's slow transformation. St. Mary Mead seemed to invite secrets, she thought. Behind every cottage door, behind every carefully maintained garden wall, lay stories waiting to be uncovered. The needlework in her hands progressed with methodical precision, row after row of stitches forming patterns that had been perfected over decades of careful work. It was on such a grey afternoon in September that Miss Marple first heard about Eleanor Ashworth. The woman had arrived in the village 3 months prior, taking residence at Laurel House on the eastern edge of St. Mary Mead, a substantial Victorian property that had stood empty for nearly 2 years before Eleanor's arrival. She kept largely to herself, though her reputation had begun to spread through the village's social networks with remarkable speed. Whispered about at the post office, discussed over teacups at parish meetings, and analysed carefully by those ladies whose primary occupation seemed to be the observation of their neighbours. Eleanor Ashworth was by all accounts a serious collector. She devoted herself entirely to the acquisition and preservation of antique dolls, specifically those from the Victorian and Edwardian periods. Her obsession was mentioned in hushed tones at the parish teas, spoken of with the peculiar mixture of admiration and concern that small villages reserve for outsiders with unusual passions. There was something almost monastic about her dedication, people said, as if she had renounced the normal world in favour of communion with these artefacts of childhood. It was Mrs. Hastings, the vicar's wife, who first brought Eleanor properly into Miss Marple's awareness one afternoon in mid-September. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with that particular air of controlled excitement that suggested she possessed information of considerable consequence. She settled herself into the comfortable chair across from Miss Marple's, accepting a cup of tea with evident gratitude. "Such a lonely woman," Mrs. Hastings began, her fingers nervously adjusting the handle of her teacup. "I called on her yesterday, thinking it only proper, you understand, and found her in a state of quite extraordinary distress. The house was beautiful, Miss Marple, absolutely beautiful, but there was something melancholy about it all, as if the woman was living in a museum rather than a home." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily in their rhythmic clicking. Distress? Has something happened to her directly, or is it the distress of circumstance? "Well, not precisely a current event," Mrs. Hastings replied, accepting a scone from the plate Miss Marple offered. "But she was examining her collection, and I confess I was quite taken aback by its scope. Miss Marple, there must be dozens of dolls in that house, hundreds perhaps, though I couldn't count them precisely, all arranged in glass cases, all documented meticulously in leather-bound ledgers. She showed me one of the ledgers, you see, and I've never seen such careful organisation. Each doll catalogued with its maker, its approximate date of manufacture, its provenance, the price she paid for it, even the name she has given it, as if these were living persons rather than inanimate objects." "A serious collector, then," Miss Marple observed, returning to her knitting. "Obsessive would be more accurate," Mrs. Hastings said, with the certainty of someone who has discovered an important truth. "She told me that these dolls represent her life's work, that she has spent the last decade travelling throughout Europe, attending auctions in Paris and Vienna, corresponding with other collectors in America and Australia, all in pursuit of completing her collection. There was something almost desperate about it, as if completing this collection was not merely a hobby but a matter of profound personal significance." "Did she explain why these dolls held such importance for her?" Miss Marple asked gently. "She mentioned a great loss. though she was reluctant to elaborate, Mrs. Hastings continued. Something about dolls that belonged to her family, dolls she had been trying to locate for years. She said that when she was a girl, her grandmother possessed one of the finest collections in all of Europe, but that the collection had been dispersed, lost to her family. She didn't explain the circumstances, but I gathered it was something that caused her considerable pain. The way her hands trembled when she spoke of it suggested deep emotion beneath the surface. After Mrs. Hastings left, having spent nearly 2 hours in Miss Marple's parlour, discussing not only Eleanor Ashworth but the intricacies of various village matters, Miss Marple found herself thinking carefully about what she had learned. She had discovered long ago that obsessions were never simple matters. They always pointed to something deeper, some wound that refused to heal, some injustice that demanded redress, some loss that could never be entirely compensated for, but only acknowledged and honoured through dedicated action. It was therefore with particular attention that Miss Marple received the news, some weeks later in early November, of Miss Helena Blackwell's arrival in St. Mary Mead to establish a doll restoration workshop. The timing seemed too convenient to be merely coincidental, and Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts about such matters. Helena Blackwell arrived on a Tuesday, travelling by train from London with several large crates of equipment and tools. She had taken rooms above the old chemist's shop on the High Street, and set about converting the considerable upper floor space into a restoration studio. The work proceeded with remarkable efficiency, suggesting that Helena had done this conversion before and knew exactly what she required to establish her working environment. Miss Marple visited the workshop within a week of its opening, claiming that she had heard of Miss Blackwell's arrival and wished to welcome her to the village, though in fact her visit was motivated by considerably more complex curiosity. She found Helena to be a woman in her early 50s, with sharp features that suggested intelligence and a kind of contained energy, despite her quiet demeanour. Her hands were surprisingly gentle as she worked, moving with precision that spoke of decades of practice and refinement. The workshop was immaculate, organised with an almost obsessive attention to detail that reminded Miss Marple of the descriptions she had heard of Eleanor Ashworth's own organisational methods. Restoration tools were arranged in careful rows, each one labelled and precisely positioned. Shelves contained bottles of specialised chemicals for cleaning and restoration, each clearly marked with its contents and purpose. Glass cases displayed dolls in various stages of repair, each one labelled with detailed notes regarding its treatment, the materials used, the expected timeline for completion. "Miss Marple," Helena greeted her warmly, setting down her work with evident care. "How kind of you to visit. I understand you're something of a fixture in this village, the person to whom all interesting information eventually finds its way. I'm delighted to make your acquaintance." "People are kind enough to keep me informed of village matters," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "I find it useful, in my small way, to understand the currents that move through our community. And you've come to us as a restorer of dolls, I understand. That's quite a specialised profession." "Yes, quite specialised indeed," Helena said, and there was genuine pride evident in her voice. "I've spent 30 years learning my trade and another 5 years refining my techniques. There's no greater satisfaction than bringing a damaged piece back to beauty, you see. These dolls, they carry such history within them. A child's beloved companion, worn and loved through years of play, a young woman's most prized possession, kept safe and treasured. Items passed down through generations, each one representing a moment of connection between people separated by time. To restore them is to honour that legacy, to ensure that the objects continue to carry meaning and beauty forward into future generations." Miss Marple examined the dolls in the workshop with genuine interest, moving carefully from case to case, and noting the meticulous care with which each piece had been handled. There was one in particular, a porcelain doll with glass eyes that seemed almost alive in their expressiveness, and delicate hand-painted features that suggested the work of an artist of considerable skill that caught her attention and held it. "That one is quite extraordinary," Miss Marple observed, moving closer to examine it more carefully. "The craftsmanship is remarkable. The detail of the eyes alone suggests an artist of considerable talent." "Isn't it extraordinary?" Helena agreed. carefully lifting the doll with hands that conveyed profound respect for the object. German manufacture, approximately 1880, created by one of the finer makers of the period, whose name is now largely forgotten by history, though their work is instantly recognizable to those who understand these things. This particular doll came to me in rather poor condition. The previous owner kept it in a damp environment, and the bisque had begun to show signs of deterioration. The costume was stained and torn. But look at the craftsmanship, the delicate detail. This doll was created by someone who understood beauty at a fundamental level, someone for whom creating beauty was not merely a profession but a calling. As Miss Marple made her way home through the November afternoon, the streets of St. Mary Mead growing darker as the season advanced, she found herself thinking about the convergence of two women in the village, both obsessed with dolls, both carrying something unspoken in their manner. Experience had taught her that such coincidences were rarely merely coincidental. They generally indicated the presence of deeper currents moving beneath the surface of village life, currents that would eventually reveal their nature and purpose. Chapter 2. The Hidden Inventory. The winter came early that year, and with it came a peculiar bustle to Eleanor Ashworth's household. Miss Marple noticed, through careful observation during her regular constitutional walks through the village, that Eleanor received frequent deliveries. Boxes and crates arrived regularly at Laurel House, often late in the afternoon when the light was fading, often handled with extraordinary care by delivery men, who seemed to have been specially instructed in the proper treatment of their cargo. It was Miss Weatherby, the perpetual observer of village comings and goings, who provided Miss Marple with more specific and illuminating information. She appeared at Miss Marple's cottage one afternoon in early December, her expression suggesting that she possessed information of considerable significance. Miss Weatherby was known throughout the village for her ability to see and remember details, an ability she employed with unrelenting dedication. "You should see the inventory she's assembled," Miss Weatherby said during one of their informal meetings, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone she employed for particularly interesting gossip. "I happened to encounter her at the post office, and she was collecting a package. We fell into conversation, as one does, and she mentioned quite casually that she's located another 3 dolls from the collection she'd been seeking. 3 more pieces," she said, as if this were merely a routine matter, though there was something in her voice that suggested deep emotion beneath the casual statement. "From the collection she seeks," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, her knitting needles pausing in their regular rhythm. "So she's on a quest of sorts, a project that carries personal meaning." "Indeed," Miss Weatherby continued, settling deeper into her chair with evident satisfaction at having captured Miss Marple's full attention. "And she's apparently quite willing to pay substantial sums to recover these specific pieces. There's something almost desperate about it, I thought, though she presents it all very matter-of-factly. A woman of considerable means, certainly, but driven by more than mere collecting interest. The way her hands trembled when she showed me the photographs of the dolls suggested deep emotion beneath the surface, though she maintained absolute composure in her manner of speech. Miss Marple's curiosity, which had been engaged since Eleanor Ashworth's arrival, now became more active and focused. She determined to take tea with Eleanor Ashworth at the earliest opportunity, thinking that direct conversation might provide insights that observation alone could not offer. The invitation came in the form of a formal written note, delivered by post early in December. Eleanor had written to invite Miss Marple to take tea at Laurel House on the following Thursday afternoon. The invitation was couched in polite but clearly genuine terms, suggesting that Eleanor had inquired about Miss Marple and decided that she would welcome the opportunity to make her acquaintance. Laurel House was impressive in its organisation, as Mrs. Hastings had suggested. The front parlour had been converted entirely into a display room, with glass-fronted cabinets covering every wall from floor to ceiling. The dolls within were arranged according to what appeared to be a complex system of categorization that Miss Marple immediately recognised as being based on chronological order of manufacture, with secondary organisation by geographical origin. There were dolls in elaborate Victorian costumes with meticulous attention to period detail, dolls with real human hair carefully brushed and styled, dolls of bisque porcelain and composition and the rarest and most delicate examples of early German bisque. Each bore a small label detailing its maker, its approximate date of manufacture, its place of origin, and its approximate value. "I understand you're quite the serious collector," Miss Marple said, as Eleanor poured tea with evident care, using a set of fine china that suggested the occasion held meaning for her. "Obsessed would be the more accurate term," Eleanor replied, and there was a bitter smile on her lips as she spoke, a smile that suggested complex emotions beneath the surface of her composure. "Though I prefer to think of it as dedicated recovery, a process of restoring what was lost, of honouring what was destroyed through negligence and greed. Miss Marple, would you like to hear the story behind this collection? I find that few people are genuinely interested, but I sense that you might be different. You have the look of someone who understands the importance of what seems insignificant to others." Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her knitting needles stilled in her lap, and indicated that she was indeed ready and willing to listen. "My grandmother," Eleanor began, her voice taking on a quality of reverence, was one of the finest collectors of antique dolls in all of Europe. She spent 50 years, literally half a century, acquiring them, travelling throughout France and Germany and Austria, attending auctions and estate sales, corresponding with dealers and other collectors. She had a gift for identifying genuine artistry, for understanding the history embedded within these objects. She possessed over 200 dolls when she died, each one catalogued, each one insured, each one representing an investment not merely of money, but of her life's attention and devotion. "And when she died?" Miss Marple prompted gently, knowing that this was the point where the story would become difficult. "When she died, my father sold them," Eleanor said, and her voice carried with it the weight of old pain, anger barely contained by the passage of 20 years. "Not out of necessity, I must understand. Our family had means, but out of indifference, out of a fundamental failure to understand what those dolls meant, what they represented beyond their monetary value. My father saw them as objects, as assets to be converted to cash. He saw them as pieces of furniture that could be liquidated. He did not see them as my grandmother had seen them, as windows into human creativity and history, as objects worthy of preservation and honour." Eleanor rose and walked to one of the glass cases, running her finger gently along its edge, though not actually touching the dolls within. "I was only 16 when she died," Eleanor continued, her voice tight with emotion that she was making considerable effort to control. "I was still at school, still developing my own understanding of what my grandmother's work meant. I watched my father liquidate her entire life's work as if he were disposing of furniture from a house he was vacating. He hired what he believed was a reputable firm to manage the estate sale. Thornbury and Associates, they were called, a company that specialised in the liquidation of estates. They assured my father that they would properly catalogue and sell the collection through legitimate auction houses, that every piece would be accounted for, that maximum value would be obtained. But something went terribly wrong, Miss Marple said, making it not a question but a statement of fact. "Something went terribly wrong," Eleanor confirmed. "My father hired an investigator after the sale was complete. You see, he began to notice inconsistencies in the records. Dolls that were listed in the estate inventory as sold at auction never appeared in the records of those auctions. Valuable pieces simply vanished from the documented sales. Important dolls that should have generated considerable sums appeared to have sold for fractions of their actual value. The investigation proceeded slowly, meticulously, but it took months to accumulate enough evidence to suggest that something systematic had occurred, something beyond the normal losses and discrepancies that occur in any large estate sale." "You believe they were stolen?" Miss Marple asked. "I know they were stolen," Eleanor said, her voice now carrying absolute certainty. "Not stolen in the sense of common theft, but stolen through a systematic process of substitution and diversion. My father's investigator, a man named Harrington, who was quite thorough and meticulous in his methods, eventually determined that approximately 40 of the dolls from my grandmother's collection had been replaced with carefully crafted replicas before the sale took place. The replicas were good enough to fool casual observers, to pass through the auction process without raising serious suspicion. But they were not the genuine articles. And the original dolls, Miss Marple inquired, were diverted to private collectors, sold to wealthy individuals who asked no difficult questions about provenance, and paid substantial sums for pieces that they believed to be coming from legitimate auction sources. The investigation concluded eventually, but the trail had grown too cold. Many of the pieces had already been dispersed across Europe and America. My father died shortly after the investigation concluded. Heartbroken, I think, not over the loss of the dolls themselves, but over his betrayal of my grandmother's legacy, his failure to properly honour what she had created. Eleanor returned to her chair and resumed serving tea with a steady hand that belied the emotion evident in her voice. I inherited the investigation's complete files when my father died, Eleanor continued. Harrington's notes, the photographs, the inventory lists, the detailed analysis of what had occurred. I was 22 years old, Miss Marple, and I made a decision. I would spend my life recovering those dolls, one by one if necessary. I would track them down, wherever they had gone, whatever hands they had passed through. I would recover them and honour my grandmother's memory by ensuring that her collection was restored and preserved properly. And have you been successful? Miss Marple asked. Partially, Eleanor replied. I've devoted 20 years to this effort, travelling constantly in the early years, learning about the market in antique dolls, teaching myself to authenticate pieces, learning to identify genuine dolls from replicas. I've located 17 of the missing pieces. Each one took time and money and considerable detective work, correspondence with collectors and dealers, attendance at auctions where I hoped these pieces might appear. But there remain still nearly 40 dolls unaccounted for. Some of them, I suspect, are lost to history, sold to collectors who have since passed away, moved to countries from which they cannot easily be traced, or destroyed in ways we'll never discover. But these 40 that I've recovered are safe, and they're documented, and they're being preserved as my grandmother intended. And Miss Blackwell, Miss Marple asked, how does the restoration specialist fit into your plan? Miss Blackwell came to my attention through a dealer in London who specialises in antique dolls, Eleanor explained. He mentioned her reputation, her meticulous work, her understanding not merely of restoration technique but of historical accuracy. I engaged her to restore some of the dolls I've already recovered. The restoration process can reveal details, original markings, that help authenticate pieces and trace their origins. Miss Blackwell's work is exceptional, Miss Marple. She doesn't merely repair damage, she reveals the original intent of the creator. As Miss Marple walked home through the December evening, the village dark and cold around her, she found herself thinking deeply about the network of connections that seemed to be forming. A collection stolen years ago, a woman driven by family obligation and personal dedication to recover it, a skilled restorer newly arrived in the village and now employed in this recovery process. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern, though she could not yet discern the complete design. Chapter 3. The Poisoned Needle. January brought frost that made the village paths treacherous, and with it came a kind of suspended darkness that seemed to last from morning until late afternoon. It was on a particularly cold Tuesday, the 23rd of January, that word came to Miss Marple of Helena Blackwell's death. The news arrived by telephone, brought to her by Inspector Craddock, who had become a regular correspondent with Miss Marple over the years. Valuing her insights and her particular understanding of human nature that seemed to cut through the complexity of criminal investigation with remarkable clarity. His voice through the telephone line carried unusual tension, suggesting that this case held elements that troubled his professional understanding. It's quite a curious matter, the inspector explained, his words coming carefully, as if he were working through the information as he spoke. Miss Blackwell was found in her workshop this morning at approximately 8 o'clock by her assistant, a young woman named Margaret Collins. Miss Blackwell had been working on a restoration, a porcelain doll that had arrived the previous day from Miss Eleanor Ashworth, a resident of the village. The doll is quite valuable, apparently, a German piece from the 1870s, with the kind of craftsmanship that suggests it was created by an artist of considerable skill. "And Miss Blackwell?" Miss Marple asked, though she already sensed the direction the conversation would take. "Miss Blackwell appears to have pricked her finger on one of the restoration needles," the inspector continued. "The needle apparently came from the doll's assembly, perhaps dislodged during some earlier damage, though the exact mechanism of how it became available is not entirely clear to us yet. The young woman, Margaret, said that Miss Blackwell was examining the doll closely, beginning the restoration process, and she seemed to catch her finger on something. She drew back with an exclamation of pain. A few moments later she complained of extraordinary pain, said that her finger was burning, that she felt an unusual numbness beginning to spread through her hand." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled entirely, suspended in mid-air as she processed this information. "Inspector, I think you should come to my cottage. There are matters I believe you need to understand, matters that may bear directly on your investigation." When Inspector Craddock arrived an hour later, having driven through the frost-covered lanes with careful attention to safety, Miss Marple provided him with a detailed accounting of what she had learned about Eleanor Ashworth's guest to recover her grandmother's collection, about the systematic theft that had occurred during the original estate liquidation, about the employment of Helena Blackwell as a restoration specialist. "It seems clear," the inspector said thoughtfully, settling into the chair across from Miss Marple's, after declining tea in favour of focusing on the matter at hand, "that Eleanor Ashworth had some connection to Miss Blackwell, that they had business dealings related to the restoration of the dolls in Miss Ashworth's collection. But why would she poison a woman she'd hired to restore her dolls? It makes no sense from the standpoint of conventional motivation." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested carefully, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm, "because Miss Blackwell was not quite what she appeared to be. Perhaps there was some connection between Miss Blackwell and the original theft of Eleanor's grandmother's collection, some involvement that went beyond mere coincidence." The inspector looked at her sharply, his mind clearly working through the implications of this suggestion. "You suspect Miss Blackwell of something beyond her role as a restorer?" "I suspect," Miss Marple said, with careful precision, "that you should examine Miss Blackwell's financial records, her background, the sources of the pieces she claims to have restored in previous years. Women who are obsessed with security and order, as Miss Blackwell appeared to be, are often precise about other matters as well. A person who maintains such careful records of her work, who organizes her workspace with such meticulous attention to detail, might also maintain other, perhaps less savoury records. And if there was a connection between Miss Blackwell and the earlier theft, that connection might be documented somewhere in her papers or her correspondence." The investigation that followed over the subsequent weeks would prove Miss Marple's suspicions to be correct in ways that no one could have fully anticipated. Chapter 4. The Missing Dolls. Detective work by the authorities revealed that Helena Blackwell's background was far from what she had claimed. Her name was not actually Blackwell, but Hartwell, and her history included a considerable amount of time spent working as an estimator and asset manager for various estate liquidation firms, including the Thornbury and Associates company that had handled Eleanor's grandmother's collection 20 years earlier. Inspector Craddock presented his findings to Miss Marple over tea one afternoon in mid-February, sitting in her comfortable parlour, as outside the windows the village remained locked in winter's grip. The pieces of the puzzle were now beginning to align themselves into a coherent, if troubling, pattern that suggested both criminal sophistication and a remarkable degree of opportunistic deception. "She worked for Ashworth's estate firm," the inspector explained, his expression conveying the sense of profound disturbance that the revelation had caused him. 20 years ago, when Eleanor's father hired Thornbury and Associates to liquidate the doll collection, our investigation has uncovered evidence suggesting that Hartwell, then using the name Helena Brooke and working as an estimator for the firm, was responsible for systematically replacing valuable dolls from the collection with skillfully crafted replicas. "Replicas?" Miss Marple asked, though she had already deduced as much from Eleanor's earlier descriptions. "Yes, quite extraordinary ones," the inspector continued, a note of professional admiration evident in his voice despite the criminal nature of the work being discussed. "She apparently had a talent for identifying valuable pieces, understanding their construction, and creating passable imitations. The originals she would divert to private collectors, often wealthy individuals who asked no questions about provenance and paid substantial sums for pieces that appeared to come from legitimate auctions. It was a sophisticated operation, Miss Marple, involving coordination with several employees at the auction houses and at the estate firm itself. And the money? Miss Marple inquired, her needles clicking steadily. Divided, we believe, between Hartwell and several auction house employees who provided her with access to the estate pieces and who facilitated their sale through unofficial channels. The scheme was well organised, Miss Marple, with clear division of labour and responsibility. Over the course of several months, during the period when the Ashworth collection was being liquidated, Hartwell replaced nearly 40 dolls with replicas. The estate sale went forward apparently normally, with no obvious indication that anything was amiss. The replicas sold for a fraction of what the originals would have brought, and no one suspected anything was wrong, at least not in any way that could be proven. Until Eleanor Ashworth, 20 years later, began searching for her grandmother's collection, Miss Marple said softly, understanding the tragic confluence of events that had brought the past into collision with the present. Exactly, the inspector confirmed, nodding at the accuracy of her deduction. When Eleanor began tracking down pieces when she started working with specialists and other collectors, it became increasingly clear that something had gone systematically wrong during that original estate liquidation. The pieces that appeared in private collections didn't match their auction house records. Important dolls showed up in unexpected places, having been sold under different names or through different channels. And when Eleanor came to St. Mary Mead, when she engaged Helena Blackwell to restore some of the pieces she'd already recovered, well, Hartwell must have realised that the past was finally catching up with her. But why would she agree to work for Eleanor if she feared discovery? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That's the clever bit, the inspector said, with reluctant admiration for the criminal mind being discussed. Hartwell realised that by working with Eleanor, by becoming involved in the recovery process, she might be able to identify and locate other pieces from the original theft, pieces that had been hidden or dispersed in ways that had obscured their origins. Eleanor's resources and determination were valuable to her. She could use Eleanor's efforts, Eleanor's detective work, to find pieces that had been missing for 2 decades. In a sense, she was using Eleanor's obsession to complete her own unfinished business. And then Eleanor discovered something, Miss Marple said, something that revealed the truth about the original liquidation and Hartwell's role in it. We believe so, the inspector agreed. Our forensic examination of Eleanor's records with appropriate legal authorization showed that she'd been cross-referencing the estate inventory with records from various collectors and auction houses. Last month, she apparently located one of the dolls that should have appeared in the original estate sale. The piece had been in the hands of a private collector in Vienna for the past 20 years, documented and photographed. When Eleanor obtained photographs of that particular doll and compared them to the estate documentation, to the descriptions her grandmother had written in her personal letters, she saw something that troubled her. The substitution, Miss Marple said. She discovered that at least one of the dolls she believed her family had sold was actually a replica, not the genuine article. Precisely, the inspector confirmed. And she had begun to suspect that Hartwell was connected to the original crime, that Hartwell's unexpected arrival in the village was not coincidental, but related to Eleanor's recovery efforts. Eleanor was preparing to bring her suspicions to us when Hartwell acted, or rather, when Eleanor took action based on her suspicions and discoveries. Chapter 5. The Doll Within the Doll. As January progressed into February, the investigation took on an increasingly complex character. The doll that had caused Helena Blackwell's death became the central focus of the inquiry, examined by forensic specialists and restorers alike. Miss Marple was invited by Inspector Craddock to examine the piece personally, in his belief that her observations might provide useful insights that had escaped the notice of the official investigation. The doll was indeed extraordinary in its execution and artistic merit. German manufacture, dated approximately 1875 based on the construction techniques and materials used, with delicate bisque features and glass eyes that seemed almost alive in their expressiveness, conveying emotion and vitality. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of piece that Eleanor Ashworth would certainly have considered irreplaceable, a work of genuine artistry that transcended the category of toy or children's object. This doll was delivered to Hartwell's workshop on January 22nd, the inspector explained, guiding Miss Marple through the details of the investigation with patient precision. It came from Eleanor Ashworth with a request for restoration work. The costume, an elaborate Victorian dress with careful attention to period detail, needed cleaning and some minor repairs. There was some damage to the left arm, apparently from an earlier incident, that required careful restoration work to return it to its original appearance. "And the needle?" Miss Marple asked, though she had already begun to understand the mechanism by which Helena Blackwell had met her death. "That's where it becomes truly remarkable, and quite sophisticated in its planning," the inspector said, his professional admiration for the criminal ingenuity evident in his tone. The needle that killed Hartwell didn't come from this doll's original assembly. It was placed there deliberately, inserted into a seam in the doll's clothing, in such a way that it would be dislodged when the doll was handled during the restoration process. The needle itself had been treated with a lethal toxin, one that our toxicology experts have identified as a variation of a poison commonly used in industrial applications, but obtainable through various online sources, if one knew where to look and was willing to use false names and anonymous payment methods. Miss Marple examined the doll with careful attention, noting the precise stitching of its costume, the careful placement of the seams, the manner in which the needle had been integrated into the fabric in such a way as to appear almost natural. "Someone with considerable skill with a needle," she observed. "Someone who understood not merely the mechanics of restoration, but the psychology of how a skilled restorer would approach her work." "Eleanor Ashworth," the inspector confirmed. "Her house was searched with appropriate legal authorization, and we found substantial evidence of doll restoration in her private chambers. She had taught herself the craft over the years, apparently, while tracking down her grandmother's collection and working with various restoration specialists. She had the knowledge, the skill, and most importantly the motivation. The evidence against her is substantial, Miss Marple. She had access to the doll, she had the technical knowledge to create the poisoned needle device, she had identified Hartwell as the thief responsible for the original crime. All the elements of premeditation are present." "Tell me," Miss Marple said, setting down the doll with care and returning her attention to the inspector, "how did Eleanor Ashworth discover that Helena Hartwell was responsible for the original theft and substitution?" "Quite cleverly, actually," the inspector said, settling back in his chair as he explained the details of Eleanor's investigative process. Eleanor had been working with various collectors and auction specialists throughout Europe, people who understood the market in antique dolls and who could help her track down pieces that had been missing. One of them, a German woman named Bergmann, who runs a respected auction house in Munich, mentioned having acquired a doll from an estate sale in London approximately 20 years ago. The provenance documentation suggested that the doll should have come through the Ashworth estate sale. When Eleanor investigated further, she found not only that this particular doll was not listed in her family's estate inventory, but that its twin, the piece her family had supposedly sold at auction, was actually a carefully crafted replica. She realized that someone had systematically substituted false dolls for genuine ones. "And she traced the connection to Helena Hartwell?" Miss Marple inquired. "She did her own investigative work," the inspector confirmed. Eleanor discovered that Hartwell had worked for the estate firm during the liquidation period. From there, it was a matter of connecting various pieces of information, of building a case piece by piece, much like assembling a complex puzzle. Eleanor contacted the original investigator, an elderly man named Harrington who had retired, and he was able to provide her with details about Hartwell's involvement in the original crime. Eleanor became certain of Hartwell's guilt. She decided to test her theory in a most definitive manner. "With the poisoned needle," Miss Marple said softly, her understanding now complete. "Yes," the inspector agreed. Eleanor crafted a restoration project, selecting this particular doll, which she knew would appeal to Hartwell's professional interest. She understood Hartwell's habits from observing her work, her methodology from discussing restoration techniques. She knew that Hartwell would handle this particular doll without gloves, that she would examine it closely during the initial assessment, that she would almost certainly prick herself while working on the restoration. Miss Marple set down the doll carefully. "And Eleanor was not prosecuted for this crime?" "She was not," the inspector confirmed. The evidence is circumstantial in certain critical respects. We can prove that Eleanor had the knowledge and the opportunity. We can demonstrate that she had the motivation and the means. But we cannot definitively establish that she intentionally poisoned the needle with the knowledge that it would kill someone, or that she understood the lethal dosage would be fatal rather than merely incapacitating. In legal terms, we lack sufficient proof of premeditation in the manner required by the courts. We cannot establish beyond reasonable doubt that she intended death rather than merely injury or incapacitation. But, Miss Marple said quietly, understanding the unspoken frustration in the inspector's voice. Yes, the inspector said. I know. Eleanor Ashworth poisoned Helena Hartwell with full knowledge of what she was doing, with complete understanding of the consequences. But the law, Miss Marple, is sometimes frustratingly imprecise. It requires clear evidence of specific intent, and Eleanor was sufficiently careful in her planning and sufficiently clever in her execution that we cannot prove that intent beyond the legal requirement of absolute certainty. Chapter 6. The Collector's Confession. It was mid-February when Eleanor Ashworth came to Miss Marple's cottage, arriving in the late afternoon as the winter light was failing. The weather had turned bitter, and Eleanor's face was pale against the darkness of her winter coat, her eyes carrying the weight of something she could no longer contain internally. She asked for tea, and Miss Marple, recognizing something of profound importance in the woman's manner and demeanour, complied without comment or question. I came to confess, Eleanor said, sitting forward in her chair with her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white with the tension of her grip. I'm certain the inspector suspects that he has connected the pieces even if the legal system prevents him from taking action. I wanted someone to know the complete truth before the legal proceedings begin, if they begin. I wanted someone to understand why I did what I did, someone who might comprehend the depth of my motivation and the years of pain that preceded my action. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, the familiar ritual providing a structure to the conversation that would follow. I'm listening, Eleanor. Tell me whatever you feel you need to share. My grandmother, Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in every word, was the most remarkable woman I ever knew. She possessed a vision of beauty and artistry that informed every aspect of her life. She travelled throughout Europe, moving from city to city and country to country, acquiring dolls that spoke to her sense of aesthetic accomplishment and historical significance. Each doll represented something to her, a particular artist's vision, a moment in time when craftsmanship and artistry achieved perfect harmony, a connection to the past that honoured human creativity and skill. And when she died, Miss Marple prompted gently, sensing that Eleanor needed to tell this story, needed someone to bear witness to her narrative and her pain. When she died, my father sold them, Eleanor said, her voice becoming harder and more bitter with each word. Not out of necessity or financial desperation, but out of indifference, out of a fundamental incapacity to understand what those dolls meant, what they represented beyond their monetary value. He saw them as objects, as assets to be converted to cash, as pieces of furniture to be disposed of. He did not see them as my grandmother had seen them, as windows into human creativity and artistry, as objects worthy of preservation and honour and dedication. He did not understand that these dolls were her life's work, her legacy, her statement about what she valued in this world. Eleanor rose and walked to Miss Marple's window, looking out at the village dark and frozen beneath the February night. I was only 16 when she died, Miss Marple. Only 16, still at school, still developing my own understanding of what my grandmother's work meant, what her collection represented. I watched my father liquidate her entire life's work, as if he were disposing of furniture from a house he was vacating. I watched valuable pieces pass through his hands and into the hands of strangers who would never understand their significance. She returned to her chair, her expression hardened with the resolve that had sustained her through 20 years of dedicated work. I spent 20 years searching for those dolls, she said, finding them, recovering them, documenting them as my grandmother had done. It became my life's purpose, my own way of honouring her legacy. But as I searched, as I connected with other collectors and specialists, I began to notice inconsistencies, pieces that didn't match their documentation, dolls that appeared in private collections when they should have been in museums or lost to history. Something had gone wrong during that original estate sale. "And you traced it to Helena Hartwell," Miss Marple said. "Eventually," Eleanor confirmed. "It took years of detective work, careful investigation, patient following of leads. But yes, I discovered her connection to the estate firm, to the liquidation process. I found evidence of her work, replicas so skillfully crafted that they would fool casual observers who lacked genuine expertise. And I understood what had happened. Hartwell had stolen my grandmother's dolls, substituted fakes and sold the originals to private collectors for personal gain." "Did you confront her directly?" Miss Marple asked. "I did," Eleanor said, turning to face Miss Marple directly. "I came to her workshop in early December. I showed her my evidence, my documentation, the photographs and provenance records I had, assembled. I expected shock, denial, perhaps some expression of remorse or regret. Instead, she seemed almost amused by my discovery. She admitted everything, actually. She explained how clever she had been, how she had identified the most valuable pieces, how she had managed the replacements without anyone suspecting immediately." "And she offered to return them?" Miss Marple guessed. "No," Eleanor said harshly. "She offered to help me find them. She told me that we could work together, that she would use her knowledge of the original buyers to help me locate the remaining dolls that had been missing for 2 decades. She wanted to become my partner, to insert herself into my life's work, as if she had any legitimate claim to it, any right to participate in the recovery of what she had stolen. As if what she had done was merely a business transaction, a service she could now reverse for the right compensation, as if theft could be undone through collaboration." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. "That's when I decided she had to die. Not immediately, not in a moment of passion, but with clear deliberation. I decided that her crimes against my grandmother, against my family, demanded a response that would be commensurate with the harm she had caused. I decided that justice required her death." Miss Marple listened without judgment as Eleanor explained her reasoning, the careful planning that had extended over several weeks, the procurement of the toxin through online sources under assumed names, the use of anonymous payment methods that couldn't be easily traced. Eleanor had learned restoration work specifically to understand how dolls were handled, how they would be examined during the restoration process. She had researched Hartwell's methods, studied her workshop procedures, learned through observation exactly how she approached her work. "I created a doll that was irresistible to Hartwell's professional curiosity," Eleanor explained. "One that would lead her to handle it without gloves, to examine it closely during the restoration process. The costume was damaged in ways that would require careful, detailed work. The arm required restoration. Every element was designed to draw her attention and her hands into contact with the poisoned needle." "I considered using a slower poison," Eleanor continued, her voice now carrying a quality of clinical detachment. "Something that would seem like natural illness, a heart attack or stroke that would appear unrelated to any external cause. But I wanted her to know, in those final moments, what she had done. I wanted her to understand that her crimes had consequences, that you couldn't steal people's legacies, that you couldn't destroy families without paying a price for your actions." "And did she understand?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I'll never know," Eleanor replied. She pricked her finger and nearly immediately felt the effects of the poison. She may have realized what was happening, may have understood in those final moments that someone had engineered her death, or she may have simply felt sudden, inexplicable pain, may have been confused and frightened without understanding the source of her distress. Either way, her heart stopped, and the woman who stole my grandmother's life work was gone. "The law cannot prosecute you," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "without clearer evidence of premeditation, but that does not absolve you of the action." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I'm telling you. That's why I'm preparing to tell the inspector everything, to provide him with a complete accounting of my actions and my motivations. Whatever legal consequences come, I've decided I should bear them. But I wanted one person to know, beyond doubt, exactly what I did and why I did it. and I wanted that person to be someone who understands human nature, who has seen enough of human failings to perhaps understand, if not forgive, this particular failing of mine. Chapter 7. The Unwound Thread. The confession altered the trajectory of the investigation considerably, though as Eleanor had predicted, the legal system's requirement for clear evidence of premeditation prevented formal charges from being filed. Eleanor met with Inspector Craddock and provided him with a detailed written statement and complete documentation of her actions. She explained her motivations, her planning process, the manner in which she had obtained the toxin and created the poisoned needle device. But the matter was far from finished in Miss Marple's consideration. There remained loose threads, details that troubled her orderly mind, inconsistencies that suggested layers of complexity beneath the surface of Eleanor's explanation. She began, in her careful and unobtrusive way, to investigate further, not with any intention of interfering with the legal process, but simply because her curiosity demanded satisfaction and her understanding of human nature suggested that the complete truth had not yet been fully articulated. It was Miss Weatherby who provided the first significant piece of the puzzle that Miss Marple had been seeking. She appeared at Miss Marple's cottage one grey afternoon in late February, her expression suggesting that she had discovered information of considerable importance. Miss Weatherby's ability to observe and retain details had served her well in her self-appointed role as village observer and chronicler. "I've been thinking about that doll," Miss Weatherby said, accepting tea with obvious eagerness. "The one that killed Miss Hartwell, and I realised something quite strange, something that seemed odd when I first learned it, but which troubled me more as time passed. My cousin, you see, collects dolls as well. Not as seriously as Miss Ashworth, but she does have a genuine interest in antique pieces. She attended an auction in Vienna some 5 years ago, and she acquired a very particular piece. A tie-dye German doll from the 1870s, remarkable for its glass eyes and the delicate painting of its features. She sent me a photograph of the doll when she acquired it, and I've been looking at that photograph." Miss Weatherby produced the photograph from her bag. It was clearly the same doll that had caused Helena Blackwell's death, recognisable from the distinctive costume and the particular expression of the glass eyes. "Your cousin purchased this doll?" Miss Marple asked, studying the image carefully. "How interesting that it should appear in two different contexts." "She did," Miss Weatherby confirmed, "and she paid quite substantially for it, as I understand from her correspondence. But here's the peculiar part. The auction records indicate that the doll came from a private collection, with provenance supposedly traced to a London estate sale from approximately 20 years ago. My cousin wrote to the previous owner, making routine inquiries about the doll's history, and discovered something very odd indeed. The previous owner, a woman named Muller, had purchased the doll at approximately the same time as Miss Ashworth's grandmother's estate sale, and Muller mentioned in her correspondence that she had acquired the doll through a contact in London, a woman with expertise in doll restoration who had exceptional access to valuable pieces. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically as she processed this information, understanding the implications of what Miss Weatherby was revealing. And this woman with expertise in restoration would almost certainly be Helena Hartwell, Miss Weatherby concluded, which means that the doll Eleanor used to murder Hartwell may have been one of the dolls that Hartwell herself had stolen from the Ashworth collection originally. The very doll that Eleanor's father had supposedly sold at auction 20 years ago was actually diverted through Hartwell's criminal enterprise and eventually came back into Eleanor's possession. "That is a most remarkable coincidence," Miss Marple observed, though her expression suggested she was entertaining serious doubts about the coincidental nature of this discovery. "Isn't it?" Miss Weatherby agreed, settling deeper into her chair with evident satisfaction at having captured Miss Marple's full attention. "Which made me think, Miss Marple, what if it wasn't a coincidence at all? What if Eleanor Ashworth knew this particular doll's history? What if she deliberately chose it because it represented in her mind the perfect instrument of justice? A stolen doll, recovered through her years of searching, repurposed as a means to exact vengeance on the thief who stole it in the first place." After Miss Weatherby departed, having spent considerable time discussing the implications of her discovery, Miss Marple sat with her thoughts, her knitting laying neglected in her lap. The investigation had revealed the mechanics of the crime, But Eleanor's confession had suggested something simpler, something arising from emotional impulse rather than calculated planning. Yet Miss Weatherby's observation pointed to a deeper pattern, a layer of intention that Eleanor had perhaps not been willing to articulate fully, either to the inspector or to Miss Marple. It was this discrepancy that troubled Miss Marple most deeply. She decided, therefore, to speak directly with Eleanor Ashworth once more, to probe more deeply into the motivations that had driven her to commit this extraordinary act. Chapter 8. The Thread Traced. Eleanor agreed to meet Miss Marple once more, and they took tea again in the parlour at Laurel House, surrounded by the glass cases displaying Eleanor's recovered dolls. The collection had grown considerably since Miss Marple's previous visit. Over 40 pieces were now displayed, each carefully documented with detailed records, each representing a recovered fragment of Eleanor's grandmother's legacy. The collection filled the parlour with a sense of silent testimony to years of dedicated work and obsessive devotion. "You've recovered a considerable portion of the collection," Miss Marple observed, examining the cases with renewed attention. "Over 40 pieces now, isn't it? That represents an extraordinary amount of work over 2 decades. 38 pieces out of the original 203, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the precision of someone who had counted and recounted these numbers many times. The remainder, I suspect, are lost to history forever, sold to collectors who have since passed away, moved to countries from which they cannot easily be traced, or destroyed in ways we'll never discover. But these 38 are recovered, and they're safe, and they're preserved as my grandmother would have wanted them to be." "And you've documented them as your grandmother did?" Miss Marple asked. "I have," Eleanor confirmed. "I've created detailed catalogues with photographs, provenance information, historical context, letters from my grandmother describing each piece. In a sense, I've completed the work she began. These dolls will not be dispersed again. I've established a trust to ensure that they remain together, that they will eventually be donated to a museum that will preserve them properly for future generations." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I wonder, Eleanor, if you would tell me about the doll that killed Helena Hartwell. Miss Weatherby brought something to my attention, something that seems to suggest a deeper significance to your choice of that particular doll." Eleanor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, her hands gripping the arms of her chair with visible tension. "What would you like to know?" "I would like to know," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying the weight of understanding, "why you chose that particular doll. There must be others in your collection, pieces that would have served your purpose equally well. But you selected this one specifically, a doll that my friend Miss Weatherby has determined came originally from your grandmother's collection, was stolen by Hartwell, and later recovered by you through auction in Vienna. Why that doll, Eleanor? Why not another piece that would have served your purpose just as effectively?" A long silence followed, extending for several minutes as Eleanor seemed to wrestle with how much of the truth she was willing to reveal. Finally she rose and moved to one of the glass cases, indicating a space where a doll was notably absent, a gap in the otherwise complete arrangement. "That doll," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely audible, "was my grandmother's personal favourite. She acquired it in Munich in 1920, and she kept it in her private chambers, rather than with the rest of the collection. She wrote about it in her letters, described it as the piece that best represented her aesthetic vision, her understanding of beauty and artistry. When my father liquidated the collection, I was permitted to keep only one piece as a remembrance. I chose that doll. It was the only piece of her legacy he allowed me to keep." "And Hartwell replaced it with a replica?" Miss Marple asked. "She did," Eleanor confirmed, her voice now trembling with emotion barely contained. "I didn't realize it until much later, when I was in my 30s, and had become more knowledgeable about doll restoration and authentication. When I finally understood what had happened, when I began searching for the original, I found it in the hands of a collector in Vienna. It had passed through several owners since Hartwell's original sale, had been moved across Europe, had been bought and sold multiple times. It took me 3 years to locate the current owner, and 2 more years of negotiation to acquire it. I paid a considerable sum to recover my grandmother's favourite doll, Eleanor's voice carrying a note of bittersweet satisfaction. And then you decided to use it as "The instrument of Hartwell's death," Miss Marple said quietly. "It seemed appropriate," Eleanor replied. "The doll that Hartwell had stolen from my grandmother, that had been removed from our family and dispersed into the world for profit, came back to us only to become the tool of vengeance against the woman who had taken it. There was a kind of justice in that symmetry, don't you think? A kind of poetic resolution that felt right to me, that felt like my grandmother would have understood and perhaps even approved." Miss Marple considered the question carefully, her understanding of human nature suggesting that the situation was more complex than Eleanor's explanation suggested. "I think there was a kind of poetic justice, yes. But I wonder if you're being entirely truthful with yourself, Eleanor. I wonder if the poison was truly meant as an act of justice, or if it was something more personal, something rooted in grief and loss that predated your discovery of Hartwell's crimes." Eleanor turned to face Miss Marple directly, her expression defensive. "What do you mean?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding human motivation, "that you've spent 20 years of your life trying to recover a collection that was never truly yours, trying to correct a wrong that happened before you were emotionally equipped to understand it properly. I think that your grandmother's death, your father's indifference to her legacy, Hartwell's theft, all of these things became tangled together in your mind as a single injustice, a single wound that demanded healing and compensation. And I think that when you discovered Hartwell's role in the original theft, you found in her a focus for all of that accumulated grief and anger that had been building for 2 decades. You're suggesting my motivations were more psychological than logical," Eleanor said, a hint of defensiveness in her voice. "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that human motivations are rarely purely one thing or another, that we are all complicated creatures driven by impulses we don't fully understand, that we justify to ourselves in ways that make sense only to our own hearts and our own private understandings of the world. You acted, Eleanor, with deliberation and planning, with careful consideration and technical expertise, but you acted from a place of wounded emotion, not cool calculation. That doesn't absolve you of responsibility for your actions, but it does, I think, explain it in a way that pure logic cannot." Chapter 9. The Justice of Small Villages. As spring approached, bringing with it the first signs of renewal and growth to the village gardens, the legal system ground forward with its characteristic inexorable process. Eleanor Ashworth's legal situation remained ambiguous, the evidence circumstantial enough that no formal charges were ultimately filed, though the inspector maintained his private certainty about her guilt. The village of St. Mary Mead found itself briefly thrust into the unwelcome spotlight of public attention as journalists and legal observers descended upon the quiet community, seeking interviews with those who had known the accused and hoping to generate human interest in what was, from a strictly legal standpoint, a somewhat straightforward case. Miss Marple, as she had done in previous matters of local significance, found herself approached repeatedly by those seeking her insights and observations. She declined most interviews politely, preferring to maintain her customary discretion regarding matters of deep personal significance. She gave no statements to the press, offered no commentary on Eleanor's actions or motivations. The village seemed divided in its response to the case. Some residents sympathized with Eleanor's position, understanding her decades-long quest to recover her family's heritage and the provocation she had endured upon discovering the theft. Others condemned her actions as vigilante justice, arguing that the proper course would have been to work through the legal system despite its potential limitations. Still, others remained uncertain, unable to decide between empathy for Eleanor's loss and condemnation of her method. It was the judge's direction, however, that proved most remarkable. In his summing up of the case during the legal proceedings that did eventually commence, His Honour acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the crime, the complex emotional landscape that had led to Eleanor's actions. He noted her previously unblemished character, her years of devoted work to recover her family's heritage, the deep provocation she had endured upon discovering the systematic theft of her grandmother's collection. The circumstances of the case, the judge stated, suggested motivations that transcended ordinary criminal intent. While the law required clear evidence of premeditation, the evidence in this case, though circumstantial, suggested a woman driven to extraordinary action by extraordinary circumstances. The judge expressed his view that the law itself might be inadequate to address such situations, that there existed a gap between legal justice and moral justice that courts of law could not easily bridge. The verdict that finally came, in May as the village gardens were bursting into bloom and the weather had turned warmer and more welcoming, was notable primarily for its absence. No formal charges were filed. Eleanor Ashworth was not prosecuted, the legal system finding the evidence insufficient to meet the required standard of proof. She remained free, though the village knew what she had done, and she knew that they knew. The recovered dolls from Eleanor's collection were placed into a trust established by mutual agreement between Eleanor and the court system. They would eventually be donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where they would be preserved and displayed as part of Eleanor's grandmother's historical collection, properly attributed and celebrated. A plaque would be installed detailing Eleanor's decades-long effort to recover the collection, honouring her work and her dedication to preserving her grandmother's legacy. Miss Marple attended one final meeting with Eleanor, taking tea at Laurel House, after the legal proceedings had concluded and the media attention had faded. Eleanor seemed both relieved and melancholy. The tension that had sustained her through years of obsessive work now released, leaving her with a sense of emptiness and loss. "The collection will be preserved," Eleanor said, looking around the parlour at the glass cases that soon would be emptied. "My grandmother's life's work will be honoured and displayed. That's what I wanted, isn't it? That's what I told myself was my goal." "It was indeed your stated goal," Miss Marple said gently. "But I wonder if it was truly enough for you. I wonder if the recovery of the collection alone could have satisfied the need that drove you for 2 decades. Eleanor smiled sadly. "You're right, of course. The collection was never really the point, was it? The point was justice, was punishment, was making someone pay for what had been lost. I told myself it was about preserving my grandmother's memory, but really it was about my own grief, my own anger at what had been taken from me." "And did her death provide you with the justice you sought?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Eleanor replied quietly. "It didn't. It simply added another death, another tragedy to the tangled history of my family's collection. It didn't bring my grandmother back. It didn't restore what was lost. It only created more loss, more pain. I don't think justice was ever really possible, Miss Marple. I think what I actually sought was revenge, and revenge, as I've learned through bitter experience, provides no satisfaction whatsoever." Chapter 10. The conclusion of the pattern. By late June, as summer arrived in full force, and the village settled into the warm rhythms of the season, St. Mary Mead had largely returned to its accustomed tranquillity. The journalists had departed for other stories, the trial had concluded without a verdict, and the village resumed its comfortable routines of village life. The doll hospital workshop that had been Helena Hartwell's space remained empty, no one wishing to take on the premises associated with such a dramatic and tragic death. Eventually the space would be converted to other purposes, though for years afterward villagers would remember what had transpired there. It was on a warm afternoon in early July, as Miss Marple sat in her garden examining the roses that were at the height of their summer bloom, surrounded by the familiar comfort of her gardening, that Inspector Craddock made one final visit to her cottage. He brought with him a small box wrapped in brown paper, which he placed in Miss Marple's hands without preamble or explanation. "From Eleanor," he explained, settling into the garden chair that Miss Marple had prepared for him. "She asked me to deliver it to you personally. She said you would understand its significance in ways that others might not. She also wrote you a letter, which is enclosed with the package." Miss Marple opened the box carefully, aware that whatever it contained carried meaning that went beyond its physical form. Inside was a doll, small and perfectly preserved, made of bisque with delicate painted features that suggested the work of a master craftsman. According to the documentation that accompanied it, the doll was German, manufactured in approximately 1880, and had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. "She's giving you a piece of her collection?" Inspector Craddock asked, clearly surprised by this action. In a manner of speaking, Miss Marple replied softly, turning the doll carefully in her hands, though I suspect the significance runs considerably deeper than a simple gift. This doll must have considerable value, both monetary and historical. Why would Eleanor part with it? She examined the doll with careful attention, noting the expert craftsmanship evident in every detail, the beauty of the work, the obvious dedication of the artist who had created this piece. Eleanor's grandmother would have loved this doll deeply, Miss Marple thought. There was something in its construction that spoke of genuine care, of an artist's passion translated into form and colour and delicate detail. "There's a letter as well," the inspector said, withdrawing an envelope from his pocket and offering it to Miss Marple. Miss Marple read Eleanor's words, written in a careful hand from her home, now empty of the collection that had defined her life for 2 decades. Eleanor explained that the doll was a gift meant to serve as a reminder of the complexity of human nature, of the ways that love and loss, grief and justice could become entangled in ways that led to tragedy and destructive action. She had chosen this particular doll because it had been her grandmother's favourite, because it represented all that was beautiful in the collection, all that had been wronged when it was stolen and dispersed into the world, all that had been recovered through years of dedicated work and determination. "She's asking me to keep it?" Miss Marple asked the inspector, her voice carrying wonder and sadness in equal measure. "She's asking you to understand," he replied. "She told me in her letter that you were the only person who had seen her clearly, who had understood what drove her to commit such an extraordinary act. She wanted you to have something that represented what her grandmother had created, what had been taken, and what had been recovered. She wanted you to have a tangible reminder of the case, something to help you remember not merely the crime, but the human story beneath it." After the inspector departed, having shared tea and conversation about the conclusion of the case and its implications, Miss Marple sat alone in her garden with the doll. She placed it on the small table beside her chair and resumed her knitting, working on a project that had engaged her for months, the needles moving with the automatic rhythm born of decades of practice. As the light began to fade toward evening, the sun casting long shadows across her garden, Miss Marple reflected on the case that had occupied so much of her attention over the winter and spring months. A woman seeking to recover her family's legacy, a thief who had violated that legacy for personal gain, a confrontation that had ended in death, and underneath it all, the perennial truth that she had learned across her long life, observing the complexities of human nature. People were endlessly complex, endlessly tragic, endlessly capable of beauty and destruction in equal measure. The doll sat quietly on the table, its glass eyes reflecting the declining sunlight, seeming to observe the garden and its occupant with patient silence. It was a beautiful object, a work of art created with genuine skill and care by an artist whose name had been forgotten, but whose vision remained evident in every detail. It was also a symbol of theft, of loss, of the lengths to which grief could drive a person, of the consequences that followed from pursuing vengeance rather than justice. And perhaps most importantly, it was a reminder that justice in the real world was rarely as clear as the law suggested it should be, that moral complexity often exceeded legal clarity, that understanding human action required looking beyond motive and method to the deeper currents of loss and love that shaped human behaviour. Miss Marple finished her row of stitches and set down her knitting. She looked at the doll for a long moment, then at her garden, where the roses were blooming in profusion, their beauty entirely indifferent to the human dramas that unfolded around them, their cycle of growth and bloom and decay continuing regardless of human intention or action. "Some patterns," she said quietly to herself, her voice barely audible in the evening stillness, "are far too complex for a single lifetime to fully understand. We do the best we can with the stitches we're given, and we hope that somewhere in the tangled work, somewhere in the intricate interweaving of threads, there is something approaching truth, something approaching justice, something approaching understanding." As the village bells rang 7 o'clock from the church tower, their sound carrying through the warm evening air, Miss Marple rose to go inside. Behind her, on the small garden table, the doll remained, a silent witness to the case that had revealed, once again, the infinite capacity of human beings for both love and cruelty, for both beauty and destruction, for both creation and revenge. The mystery of the antique doll hospital death had been solved, though not in the conventional manner of criminal procedure. But like all true mysteries, it had also raised deeper questions about justice and forgiveness, about the ways that history and loss shape human action in ways that no court of law could fully judge or comprehend. And that, Miss Marple reflected as she stepped inside her cottage, closing the door gently behind her, was perhaps as it should be. Some questions were meant to be carried in the heart, not resolved in the courts of men. Some mysteries were meant to deepen our understanding of human nature rather than provide simple answers. And some truths could only be perceived by those patient and observant enough to look beyond the obvious, to understand the complex motivations that drove people to extraordinary actions. The doll would remain on Miss Marple's table, a constant presence reminding her of Eleanor Ashworth's decades-long quest, and the tragic choices that quest had ultimately led her to make. And whenever Miss Marple looked at it, whenever she passed by it during her daily activities, she would remember that case, and all that it had taught her about the nature of justice, forgiveness, and the endlessly complex nature of human beings struggling to make sense of loss and betrayal. The end